For over 2 millennia, philosophers have debated a central question about human cognition. Does language create thought or merely transport it? From Aristotle's formal logic to the structural frameworks of modern linguistics, a persistent assumption has dominated the inquiry. This is the language of thought hypothesis. Cannot occur. We can test this assumption by looking at the clinical reality of severe aphasia. When damage occurs in specific left hemisphere cortical regions, patients can lose their linguistic capabilities entirely. They become unable to comprehend sentences or articulate even simple words. Yet these patients present a challenge to the language of thought hypothesis. Despite having profound linguistic deficits, many individuals with severe aphasia retain a high capacity for abstract, language-free reasoning. When presented with cognitive puzzles, they navigate complex symbolic transformations, discover inductive rules from limited data, and excel at visual matrix reasoning. Because they lack words, these patients communicate the logical rules they discover through alternative mediums, relying on hand gestures and physical drawings to demonstrate they have internally solved the problem. The underlying logical organization remains intact. The reasoning occurs first. Language acts as a secondary, highly specialized medium to translate that logic into socially shared symbols. Recent neuroscientific research from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology provides empirical data for this separation. Researchers monitored brain activity in real time while subjects performed complex reasoning tasks. In baseline functional anatomy, classical language processing regions like Broca's and Wernicke's areas remained largely inactive during reasoning puzzles. The brain computed, but language centers were quiet. Instead, fMRI detected intense firing in separate neural systems, divorced from linguistic production. This localized activity suggests that logical computation and linguistic processing are partially independent cognitive functions, utilizing different physical networks in the brain. Language still plays a role in human interaction, but its role is expressive. It operates downstream from the actual cognitive machinery that solves problems and parses reality. If language does not generate logic, we have to find the mechanism that does. The brain relies on a deeper, progressive organizational structure, a regulatory continuum that shapes raw data into coherent thought. This neuroscientific distinction between the origin of logic and its expression echoes a centuries-old debate in Islamic intellectual history, one that also found it necessary to separate the process of internal discovery from its external defense. In the tradition of falsafa, or philosophy, the objective was the pursuit of first principles. It operated as an open-ended inquiry, using reason to define existence and construct metaphysical systems, regardless of where the logic led. Conversely, kalam, or dialectical theology, operated within a pre-accepted framework of revelation. Its primary function was interpretation, defense, and the linguistic articulation needed to reconcile religious doctrine with philosophical critique. This chart contrasts their specific cognitive objectives. Falsafa represents the internal logic of discovery. Kalam represents the linguistic articulation required for defense. Both employ rigorous logic, but they apply it to different ends. This separation reached a sophisticated synthesis in the work of the 17th century philosopher Mulla Sadra. He integrated rational demonstration, theological tradition, and direct mystical intuition into a single framework. In Sadra's synthesis, language is not the ultimate arbiter of truth. It is simply one stage within a broader hierarchy of intellectual maturation, acting as the interface for knowledge acquired through deeper faculties. Modern neuroimaging and classical Islamic philosophy arrive at a similar structural conclusion. Logic and reason form the foundational architecture of thought, while language provides the expressive interface. To understand exactly how that foundational architecture forms without language, we can apply the Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM. This model asks how logical organization emerges directly from evolving neural dynamics. BKM utilizes continuity theory.
Rather than treating logic as an isolated symbolic calculator, continuity theory models cognition as an uninterrupted, progressive sequence of regulatory states. The model begins with instinct and sensation. Integrating these, the brain ascends to perception and feeling. Through large-scale integration, intuition emerges, stabilizing into dynamic logic, reasoning without words. Finally, these patterns lock into formal logic, pushing output into language and communication layers. The logical organization exists deep in the brain's regulatory structure before it ever translates into spoken words, mathematical notation, or physical gestures. By treating language as a late-stage output, continuity theory allows us to categorize non-discursive knowledge. We can finally parse complex human experiences that are often conflated, such as intuition, illumination, and revelation. To resolve the terminology, we have to decouple the physical state of the brain from the specific mode of knowing it is currently employing. The horizontal x-axis represents modes of knowing, spanning from automatic instinct and rapid intuition up through dynamic logic, formal reasoning, and illumination. The vertical y-axis represents states of consciousness, ranging from deep sleep and ordinary dreaming up through relaxed waking and focused analysis. Plotting cognition this way clarifies complex states. Illumination, or ishraq, requires broad cognitive coherence across multiple domains, producing direct experiential insight defying linguistic description. Revelation, meanwhile, occupies a separate theological category. Because Abrahamic traditions define revelation by its transcendent divine source, determining its origin falls outside the limits of empirical neuroscience. By separating the state from the mode, we can categorize events like big dreams structurally, mapping how they organize information while the brain is in a state of sleep. To fully map these complex phenomena, the Brain Kinematics Model requires one final metric to explain how data organizes within these different states. When we extrude this into 3 dimensions, we introduce the z-axis, the degree of regulatory integration. This measures how stable and wide-reaching the cognitive organization is at any given moment. An ordinary dream plots low on the state axis and low on the integration axis. It is the brain performing local integration, reorganizing recent memories and regulating immediate emotional responses. A Jungian big dream plots on the same sleep axis, but registers extremely high regulatory integration. It pulls from multiple long-term memory systems and emotional themes, facilitating deep intuition and personal transformation. An inside dream occurs at the exact intersection where high integration allows an unconscious intuition to stabilize into coherent, dynamic logic while the subject is asleep. Even when analyzing what traditions call a prophetic dream, BKM can track the phenomenological markers, mapping it as a high integration state, while respecting the theological boundary regarding its claimed origin. By charting state, mode, and integration, this 3-dimensional matrix offers a method for classifying the spectrum of human experience, from the most mundane thoughts to the most complex states of insight. Understanding this architecture exposes a flaw in current artificial intelligence development, the tendency to confuse linguistic fluency with actual logical reasoning. Large language models generate coherent text, but they often struggle with abstract logic. For AI to achieve maturity, its reasoning engine must be decoupled from its linguistic interface. Future cognitive architectures will need to transition from flat, language-centric models to tiered structures. They must mimic the human brain, utilizing one dedicated core for abstract reasoning and a separate, subsequent core for linguistic output. While language remains a vital scaffold for sharing and refining ideas, the data from these studies suggests that logic maintains its own distinct neural architecture. From the fMRI scans at MIT identifying silent language centers, to Mulla Sadra's philosophical hierarchy and the 3D matrix of the Brain Kinematics Model, the pattern remains consistent. The history of logic is the history of our expanding understanding of cognition itself, a continuous self-organization of reality that builds its structure in silence and only later finds its voice in language.